She always pays. My father's voice cut through the house like a blade. It was just past 8:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The living room lamp cast a warm yellow glow that didn't match the sharpness of his words. I stood frozen in the hallway, one hand resting on the cool wooden banister, listening as his whisper carried through the quiet. What would you do if you overheard your own father planning to use you? This isn't just a story, it's a quiet storm that changes everything. Don't miss a second. They didn't know I was there. From my spot by the stairs, I could see the reflection of their silhouettes in the hallway mirror, the two of them leaning close on the sofa like conspirators in a dimly lit play. My sister's laugh, soft and knowing, floated out next. She'll give in like always. She can't say no to us. The casual certainty in her voice hit harder than any insult. It wasn't even up for debate. In their minds, my role had already been decided. I was the one who paid. The one who covered their emergencies. The dependable daughter. The fixer. I didn't move. Not yet. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, filling the spaces between their sentences. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon. My sister had baked earlier something sweet for the kids. It should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like I was standing in the middle of a carefully staged lie. My father leaned back against the sofa with the ease of someone confident in his power. All you have to do, he murmured, is act a little desperate. She can't stand to see you struggle. She'll cave. My sister giggled. I'll make it sound like it's for the kids. She's soft when it comes to them. My chest tightened. For years I had told myself they didn't mean to use me. That they just leaned on me because I was responsible. But hearing it laid out like this, so coldly, so strategically, was like having the floor pulled out from under me. I pressed my palm flat against the wall, steadying myself. My heartbeat was calm. Too calm. Surprised me. I should have felt hurt or angry or humiliated. Instead, I felt something quieter. Heavier. Clarity. They thought this was the same old story. But they didn't know that I had quietly been changing the script for months. The front door creaked softly as the wind brushed against it. My sister's oldest, Lucy, padded into the hallway in her pajamas, holding her stuffed bear. She saw me and waved sleepily. I put a finger to my lips, smiling gently. "Shoo," I whispered. "Go back to bed, sweetheart." She nodded and tiptoed upstairs. Her tiny footsteps faded. For a brief moment I was reminded why I'd kept quiet for so long, why I'd written the checks, signed the papers, bailed them out again and again. It was always for the kids. They'd used that love like currency. I stayed by the stairs a little longer, letting their conversation unravel. My father talked about the new opportunity they needed money for. My sister chimed in with carefully rehearsed lines as if they were practicing a performance. "I'll call her tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll sound panicked. She'll offer before I even have to ask." "She always does," my father replied confidently. I turned away then, climbing the stairs slowly. My slippers made almost no sound on the wood. Halfway up I stopped. Something inside me shifted. It wasn't sudden rage. It was a quiet, deliberate locking into place. Like the click of a key turning in a door. I looked back down at the hallway. From this angle, I could see my father's reflection in the mirror clearly. His familiar, weathered face softened by lamplight, his hand gesturing as he explained how to manipulate me. My sister nodded along, her smile rehearsed. They didn't look like family in that moment. They looked like two strangers dividing up a prize. In my bedroom, the light from the street lamps outside spilled through the blinds, striping the carpet in pale orange lines. I sat on the edge of my bed and took a slow breath. I didn't need to write anything down. I'd memorized every word. For years I had told myself that keeping the peace was worth the cost. But peace had turned into permission. And permission had turned into entitlement. I reached over to my nightstand and opened the drawer. Inside was a slim, worn leather folder. I ran my fingers along its edge. I hadn't opened it in months, but I kept it close. Just in case. It contained documents they didn't know existed. Accounts they couldn't access. Legal steps I'd quietly taken after the last time they borrowed from me without asking. I hadn't acted on any of it, yet. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of my lips. They thought they were planning something. They had no idea a storm had been quietly gathering just out of sight. A creak in the hallway snapped my attention back. My sister stood at my doorway, framed by the dim hall light, holding a mug of tea. She didn't know I'd heard everything. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked lightly. "Something like that," I replied, keeping my voice steady. She stepped into my room, her familiar floral perfume trailing behind her. "I wanted to talk to you about something tomorrow," she said almost casually. "It's kind of important." I tilted my head, studying her. She avoided my eyes for a split second before recovering. That tiny flicker told me everything I needed to know. "I'll be here," I said simply. She smiled too quickly. "You're the best, you know that? We don't say it enough." I didn't answer. She placed the mug on my nightstand, gave me a quick squeeze on the shoulder and walked away. Her footsteps faded down the hall. The moment she disappeared, the house felt colder. Not physically, just the weight of what I now fully understood. They weren't asking for help anymore. They were planning to take. Downstairs, their voices continued. Lower now, maybe discussing details. My father's tone was firm, almost businesslike. "She won't fight back," he said. "She never does." I stood by my window, watching the faint glow of the neighbor's porch light. I thought about every time I had said yes to keep things smooth. Every time I'd told myself family came first. Every time I'd absorbed the consequences so they wouldn't have to. It was strange. Instead of breaking me, their words steadied me. They had made one mistake. They assumed I was still the same woman I'd always been. The night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine hummed and faded. My house felt both silent and alive, like it was holding its breath. I picked up the leather folder and placed it on the desk. I didn't open it, not yet. But just seeing it there gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. I turned off the light and stood by the doorway, listening. My father coughed downstairs. My sister laughed again, softer this time. They had no idea I was wide awake, listening, planning. Tomorrow morning she'd make her desperate call. And for the first time in decades, my answer wouldn't be what they expected. The clock struck midnight. I descended the stairs silently. The living room lights were still on. My father sat with his feet propped on the coffee table, talking on the phone in that half-whisper he used when he didn't want to be overheard. He didn't see me standing at the edge of the hallway. "Yeah, she'll cover it. He always does. Don't worry about the timeline. She'll move fast. She hates delays." He laughed softly. That laugh. The same one he used when I was a child and he thought he was outsmarting someone. I stepped forward just enough to make the floorboard creak. His head snapped up. Our eyes met. For a brief second, surprise flickered across his face. Then it vanished, replaced by the practiced warmth he wore like a suit. "Hey," he said casually. "You're still up." I smiled faintly. I heard voices. Just working out some details," he said, waving his hand dismissively. I nodded, saying nothing. The silence stretched between us like a tight rope. He didn't know what I'd heard. He didn't know that the next few days were about to rewrite everything. But I did. And I savored that knowledge. I turned and climbed the stairs again, his eyes following me until I disappeared from view. Tomorrow the game would begin. But tonight was the moment the pieces quietly shifted into place. They still thought I was the same woman who would pay without question. They were about to find out how wrong they were. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling his eyes on my back until I turned the corner and disappeared. Upstairs, the hallway was still and dim, the air heavy with that strange midnight quiet that makes every sound sharper. My heart wasn't racing. It moved with the same steady rhythm it had when I stood at the banister. The shock was behind me. What remained was focus. I walked straight into my bedroom and closed the door with a soft click. The house below was still awake. Faint TV chatter, the scrape of my father's chair, my sister's laugh drifting up like a ghost of what used to feel familiar. I leaned against the door for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle on my shoulders. I wasn't the same woman who'd once rushed downstairs at the first sign of trouble. That woman would have paced, worried, tried to fix things before dawn. This woman was different. I crossed to my desk and pulled open the top drawer. The familiar scent of old paper and cedar drifted out. Inside lay a neat stack of folders, financial statements, bank notices, investment summaries, all arranged in the same meticulous order I'd kept for years. Being organized had always been my defense, even when I didn't realize I was defending myself. I flicked on the small desk lamp. Its golden light carved a pool on the wood, leaving the rest of the room shadowed. It felt private, almost conspiratorial. My fingers hovered over the folders for a second before selecting the one bound with a thin blue ribbon. That folder held everything I'd quietly built in the background while pretending to be the family's safety net. I untied the ribbon slowly, almost ceremonially, and spread the documents out across the desk. Password lists, account numbers, property documents, notarized letters, things no one downstairs even suspected existed. The computer hummed to life when I tapped the keyboard. I'd always been careful. Strong passwords, no shared logins, separate email for my investments, but I'd never taken the final step of cutting them off completely. Tonight would change that. One by one I began logging into every account. Savings first. Then the CDs. The investment portfolio. As the two-factor codes pinged my phone, I felt an odd mix of calm and adrenaline. It wasn't fear. It was the kind of quiet alertness that used to come over me when my children were small and a storm rattled the windows. I'd lie awake, fully present, waiting. I started with the smallest accounts. I changed passwords, updated security questions, and removed secondary contacts. Each completed update felt like sliding a lock into place. By the time I got to the larger accounts, my rhythm was steady. Open, change, secure, document. It was methodical. Precise. A faint knock startled me. "Mom." It was my son David calling from his room down the hall. His voice was thick with sleep. "You still awake?" "Yes, sweetheart," I said, keeping my tone light. "Go back to bed. I'm just finishing some paperwork." He mumbled something about a test in the morning and shuffled back to his room. The door closed. I exhaled slowly. I hadn't told him anything about what was happening downstairs. He had his own life, his own responsibilities. I'd always shielded him from the mess. I intended to keep it that way for now. Next, I opened the shared checking account. This was the one they always used as their backup, the one I'd foolishly linked to my savings years ago. The balance glared back at me, lower than it should have been. My stomach tightened. I clicked through the transaction history and found 3 recent withdrawals I didn't authorize. Each was small enough to avoid triggering alerts, but together they painted a familiar picture. They'd already started dipping in. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking beneath me. My fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. This wasn't a future betrayal. It was already in motion. But what they didn't know was that I had quietly opened a separate trust account last spring. After the last incident, I'd taken legal advice from a friend at church, a retired attorney who'd seen too many families torn apart by money. With her help, I'd created a structure no one could touch without my explicit consent. I hadn't moved everything over yet. I'd been waiting for a reason. Tonight they gave me one. I initiated the transfer. The bank's security interface popped up, asking for confirmation codes and identity checks. My hands didn't shake. Years of being the responsible one had given me a strange fluency with these systems. I confirmed everything, double-checked the routing numbers, and watched the progress bar crawl forward. Half of my savings. Gone from their reach in under 5 minutes. I didn't stop there. I opened the property file next. The house deed. The beach cottage title. The power of attorney forms I'd quietly revoked 6 months ago without telling anyone. I scanned each page carefully. Every document had been notarized and stored both physically and digitally. My father still believed he had certain signing rights. He didn't. That was one of my hidden advantages. I had already stripped his access. He just didn't know it yet. Around 2:15 a.m. I heard the TV click off downstairs. Footsteps, my father's, crossed the living room. The refrigerator door opened. A glass clinked against the counter. Then silence. I paused, listening, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. If he came upstairs, I'd simply close the folders and say I couldn't sleep. It wouldn't be suspicious. I'd spent years playing that role convincingly. But the footsteps returned to the living room. The recliner creaked. Within minutes, soft snores floated up. I smiled faintly. Even their vigilance had blind spots. I shifted to email next. I updated recovery addresses, added encryption, deleted old family shared folders. While doing that, I stumbled on something odd. An email thread between my father and my sister's husband forwarded to me months ago but never opened. The subject line read, "Family opportunity, urgent." My cursor hovered. I clicked it. Inside were outlines of a joint investment plan. It wasn't illegal on the surface. But buried in the wording was a clause granting them full operational control over any family-contributed assets. In other words, once my money went in, it wouldn't really be mine anymore. They'd planned this for months. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. For years I'd rationalized their behavior. I told myself families are messy, people make mistakes, forgiveness is part of love. But reading their calculated language in black and white, it stripped away every illusion I'd held onto. This wasn't carelessness. It was strategy. I highlighted the email, printed a copy, and slipped it into the leather folder. If they wanted to play this like a business arrangement, then so would I. The printer whirred softly in the quiet room. As the page slid out, I glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. I still had work to do. I moved on to my retirement accounts. These were the largest and also the trickiest. I didn't want to make any moves that would alert them prematurely. Instead of transferring, I changed beneficiary designations, locking them behind 2 layers of authentication and removing both their names. For years I'd listed my sister as a secondary beneficiary for simplicity. It had been a gesture of trust. Now, with a few keystrokes, that trust was erased. A quiet sense of control filled me. Not loud triumph, not bitterness, just a steady reclaiming of what was mine. I thought about something my mother used to say: when people show you who they are in whispers, believe them before they start shouting. I'd ignored those whispers for too long. Around 3:30 a.m. I heard a faint buzz. A text message. It was from my sister. "You up?" Weird question, but can you check your email tomorrow morning? Dad and I have something we want to run by you. Love you. The casual tone nearly made me laugh. She had no idea I'd already seen everything. I didn't reply. I turned the phone face down on the desk and returned to the screen. I reviewed each lock I'd put in place. Savings secured. Shared account detached. Trust account funded. Beneficiaries updated. Documents organized. Email fortified. Step by step I was building walls they couldn't climb. At 4 a.m. I stood by the window. The first hints of dawn colored the horizon, a faint pale blue that slowly pushed away the night. Down the street, sprinklers sputtered to life, spraying neat arcs over tidy lawns. The world looked exactly the same. But in this house, everything had changed. I walked to the kitchen, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat by the small table near the window. The smell of the beans filled the room. I cupped the warm mug in my hands, listening as birds began their morning chorus. Downstairs my father stirred. A door opened. Footsteps. But this time I wasn't tense. I was ready. He walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "You're up early," he muttered. "Couldn't sleep," I said lightly, taking a sip. He glanced at the folders still stacked neatly on the counter. "You're doing your paperwork again?" I smiled politely. "Just keeping things in order." He nodded, not suspicious, just dismissive as always. As he reached for his coffee mug, he had no idea that while he'd slept downstairs, the balance of power had quietly shifted upstairs. I watched him walk out onto the porch, humming to himself, the same man who'd whispered hours earlier that I'd always pay. He still believed it. I turned back to the folders, a calm, steady resolve settling into my bones. This was only the beginning. And tomorrow, when their desperate call came, they'd discover that the woman they thought they could control no longer existed. The next morning started quietly. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee, and the sunlight crept across the counter like nothing in the world had shifted overnight. My father sat at the table, flipping through the newspaper as if the whispers, the schemes, and my midnight moves didn't exist. My sister's text from the night before still sat unopened on my phone. I took a slow sip of coffee, watching the steam curl upward. I didn't rush. I didn't mention anything. The silence between us was ordinary on the surface, but underneath, everything hummed with quiet tension. He didn't notice. He rarely did. The phone rang at 9:12 a.m. sharp. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. "Hi, sweetheart." My sister's voice spilled through, deliberately shaky. I hate to bother you so early. Something's happened." Here it was. Their carefully rehearsed act. Kept my tone even. "What's wrong?" She sniffed audibly. "Hard to explain over the phone. Could I come by? Or maybe we could talk later this afternoon. I need your help. Please." She never asked to come over unless there was money involved. "Sure," I said calmly. "Come around 1." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. Thank you. Really. You've always been there for us. I don't know what we'd do without you. I smiled faintly at the irony. See you then. The moment I hung up, I noticed my father glance over the top of his newspaper. It wasn't suspicion. It was quiet satisfaction, like someone watching a plan move into its next phase. You're seeing your sister? He asked casually, as if he hadn't been in on the whispering last night. She called, I replied, folding my arms. She said she needs to talk. He nodded slowly, his eyes returning to the print. But I caught the small smile he tried to hide. That smile told me everything I needed to know. I spent the late morning going through my emails and quietly watching. By 10 o'clock, activity began appearing on my online banking dashboard. It started small login attempts on the joint account. Then less than an hour later, there were attempts to access the investment portal. None succeeded. I didn't stop them. I wanted to see how far they'd go. I watched as they tried old passwords. Then came an attempted money transfer flagged as urgent. The system blocked it automatically. My lawyer's alert pinged minutes later. They were moving fast, faster than I'd anticipated. This wasn't just a desperate plea. This was a coordinated play. As I reviewed the activity logs, I noticed something else. A loan application submitted under my name to a small community bank I'd used years ago. It had all my correct personal details. Someone had dug through old paperwork. The application was incomplete, though, stopped by the identity verification wall I'd quietly installed months earlier. A small, sharp thrill of satisfaction ran through me. They thought the trap was set. But every rope they'd strung was tied around their own ankles. At 12:57 p.m., I heard my sister's car pull into the driveway. I was standing by the kitchen window, mug in hand, watching her step out. She wore soft colors, her hair slightly undone, the exact image of someone overwhelmed, but holding it together. If I hadn't overheard their conversation, I might have fallen for it again. She knocked softly and peeked in before I answered, her voice gentle. Hi. I hope this isn't a bad time. Not at all, I said, stepping aside to let her in. She hugged me tightly, lingering a little too long. I didn't sleep all night, she said, her voice quivering. Things are bad. I nodded, letting her talk. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't fill the silence. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd signed checks for her in the past, where I'd handed over emergency funds, where I'd listened to promises that were never kept. She began her story slowly, weaving it carefully. It involved a sudden issue with her husband's business, a delayed payment from a client, a bill that needed immediate attention to keep everything from collapsing. She had documents ready, all laid out in a neat folder. I flipped through them silently. I'd seen better forged signatures from my kids when they were teenagers. I know it's asking a lot, she said, leaning forward, eyes glossy with rehearsed emotion. But if we don't get this cleared today, we could lose everything. And the kids. There was the hook. Always the kids. I understand, I said softly, closing the folder. She relaxed slightly, misreading my tone. You've always been the strong one, she continued, her hand reaching for mine. Dad and I said last night. She stopped herself. Too late. I raised an eyebrow. Last night. Her cheeks flushed. Oh, we were talking about how much we appreciate you. Her lie was too quick, too thin. While she spoke, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the notification. It was an email from my lawyer. Loan application under your name officially flagged and frozen. Fraud alert triggered. Recommend monitoring activity this afternoon. I slid the phone face down again. She didn't notice. Did you want me to write a check? I asked casually. Her eyes lit up. If you could, just temporarily. We'd pay you back right away. You know we always do. I nearly laughed. Instead, I nodded slowly. Let me think. She exhaled shakily, clearly believing the act was working. At 1:45 p.m., just as she was refilling her water glass, my father's truck pulled into the driveway. I wasn't surprised. She never worked alone on big plays. He walked in without knocking, as he always did. Afternoon, he said cheerfully, his eyes flicking from me to her in a way that was almost imperceptible. A quick silent check-in. I smiled politely. Hello, Dad. We were just talking about the situation, my sister said, her voice slipping effortlessly into the same panicked cadence. He nodded solemnly, sliding into the seat across from me. I hate to ask you this, he began, but it's urgent. We wouldn't come to you if it weren't. I listened quietly, letting them layer their story. More pressure. More urgency. Words like today, immediate, life savings, floated through the kitchen like smoke. What they didn't know was that at that very moment, the financial institutions they were trying to use were locking everything down. My lawyer had set automatic triggers. Their loan application was frozen. The joint account was sealed. Their transfer had set off alerts. Their trap was already snapping shut on them. My father leaned back, confident. You've always been the responsible one, he said warmly. You know we'd do the same for you. I looked him straight in the eye. Would you? The silence that followed was brief but telling. He recovered quickly, smiling again. Of course. But in that heartbeat I saw the flicker of discomfort. A small crack in their practiced performance. Around 2:30 p.m. the phone rang again. My sister excused herself to answer. I could hear fragments of her conversation drifting in from the hallway. Confusion, rising frustration, then panic. What do you mean it's locked? She hissed. It's always worked before. I stood by the doorway, unseen, listening as her facade began to crumble. She returned to the kitchen moments later, her face pale. There's been some kind of mistake. The transfer didn't go through. My father frowned. What? She shook her head. They said the account's restricted. Some security thing. I don't understand. I set my mug down slowly. That's odd. They scrambled. Phone calls were made. Voices got louder. My father's confident tone cracked as he spoke to the bank. My sister paced. The trap they'd designed was now malfunctioning before their eyes, and they didn't know why. I stayed calm, sitting at the table watching them unravel in real time. By 3 p.m. their urgent crisis had hit a wall they couldn't climb. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't even refused their request. I simply let their own plan meet the defenses I'd quietly built. My father slammed his palm on the table. This doesn't make sense. Oh, it makes perfect sense, I said softly. You just didn't account for everything. They both turned to look at me, startled. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one scrambling to fix things. They were. As the afternoon light stretched across the kitchen floor, I watched their expressions shift, from control to confusion, from confusion to panic, and finally to something they'd never shown me before: fear. The trap had sprung. And it had failed spectacularly. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I simply stood, collected their folder from the table, and said, I think we're done here for today. Their silence followed me down the hallway like a shadow. I set the folder on the sideboard in the dining room and stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Behind me, my father muttered something under his breath, and my sister let out a shaky exhale. The confidence they'd walked in with had dissolved into a heavy, uneasy fog. For years, it had been me fumbling for answers while they waited. Now the roles were reversed. I turned back toward the kitchen. Would either of you like some water? I asked evenly. My father blinked at me, thrown by the normalcy of the question. My sister shook her head slowly. Neither of them moved. For the first time in a long time, they were the ones unsure of what came next. I picked up their folder, the one she'd brought with her urgent documents, and opened it as I walked back to the table. Their eyes followed me. I flipped through the papers page by page, deliberately slow. The smell of ink and cheap printer paper hung faintly in the air. You know, I said softly, not looking up, for a crisis, some of these documents are awfully polished. Almost like they were prepared ahead of time. My sister's face stiffened. What do you mean? I lifted my gaze to hers, calm but unwavering. This, I said, tapping one of the pages, was printed last week. And this form, I held up another, has my outdated signature copied onto it. You didn't even line up the date correctly. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. My father shifted in his seat. You're reading too much into this, he said, his tone dismissive, but there was a thin crack in his voice. We just needed help. There's no need to make it dramatic. I closed the folder slowly. I'm not the one who made it dramatic. You did that when you tried to move money that wasn't yours. His jaw tightened. Watch your tone. It was a familiar line. One he'd used when I was a teenager, when I challenged him, when he wanted to end an argument by reminding me who held authority. But that dynamic didn't fit anymore. I stepped closer to the table, meeting his eyes. "No," I said calmly. "I think it's time you watch yours." The air between us tightened. My sister stared at the table, hands knotted together in her lap. This was the moment I'd avoided for years. Not because I couldn't face it, but because I'd believed it would destroy what was left of our family. But watching them scramble earlier, hearing their lies, their rehearsed pleas, it had destroyed itself. All I had to do was stop patching up the cracks. My phone buzzed on the counter. I walked over and picked it up. An email from my lawyer. The subject line was short and sharp. "Actionable fraud evidence received. Next steps." I glanced through it quickly. He'd received the copies I'd sent earlier. The forged loan application, the emails, the banking logs. His message outlined the legal avenues: freezing their attempted transfers, filing fraud reports, and securing my accounts permanently. I'd spent my life shielding them from consequences. This time I was moving with them. I turned back toward the kitchen. "I'm going to need both of you to leave," I said simply. My sister looked up, startled. "What? But you came here expecting me to sign something, wire something, or hand over something," I said, keeping my tone level. "None of that is happening. And right now, I have things to handle that don't involve either of you." She glanced at my father for support. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice dropping into that controlled, heavy register he used when he wanted to intimidate. "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," I replied, unblinking. "I'm correcting one." The corner of his mouth twitched. A tiny movement, but telling. It wasn't anger I saw there. It was something closer to calculation. He was already rearranging pieces in his mind, deciding his next move. That was fine. So was I. They left reluctantly, my sister stammering promises to come back tomorrow, my father muttering about family loyalty under his breath. I stood at the window as they walked down the driveway. Her posture sagged with frustration. His was stiff, his steps clipped. I watched the truck pull away, gravel crunching under the tires, until they were gone. The house was silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as the night before. This one had weight to it, like a room that had been rearranged without anyone noticing. I carried their folder into my study. It wasn't a grand room, just a converted spare bedroom with bookshelves and a sturdy desk. The smell of old wood and paper was comforting. I set the folder down and opened my laptop. The legal steps began immediately. First, I sent my lawyer the digital copies of their forged paperwork. Then I called the bank's fraud department and confirmed that I wanted every attempt documented. My voice was steady as I answered their questions, verified my identity, and authorized the freeze on any joint activity. The woman on the other end of the line spoke in that crisp, professional tone banks use when things get serious. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "I need to let you know, the activity this morning wasn't just a loan attempt. There were also inquiries made to pull credit under your name through a third-party brokerage. That suggests coordinated effort." My stomach tightened, but not with fear. With clarity. "Document everything," I said. "And forward it to my lawyer." After the calls, I went through my home filing cabinet. I pulled out older documents, trust deeds, tax records, letters my father had me sign for convenience years ago. I examined them with new eyes. Many were harmless, but a few had gaps, areas where he'd once had access but didn't anymore. If he thought he could use old paperwork, he'd find the doors sealed. Around noon, the doorbell rang. For a moment, my pulse kicked up, thinking they'd returned early. But when I opened the door, it was someone else entirely. Elaine, my neighbor and longtime friend. She held a small tin of cookies and a curious expression. "I saw your father's truck peel out earlier," she said. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. Elaine wasn't just a neighbor. She was the one who'd quietly recommended the lawyer to me after her own brother tried to forge her signature on a property sale. She knew the patterns. I poured us both some tea and told her the short version. Not every detail, but enough. Her eyes narrowed as she listened. "They always think they're the smartest in the room," she said. "But you're doing the right thing. Quiet, clean, and documented." Her presence steadied me. It reminded me that I wasn't alone this time. After Elaine left, I drafted a formal letter with my lawyer's guidance. It outlined their actions. The forged applications, the unauthorized attempts, the prepared documents. It stated clearly that any further interference would result in legal escalation. The tone was measured, not emotional. Firm boundaries in black and white. Printing that letter felt like drawing a line on a battlefield. I slipped it into an envelope and set it aside. It would be hand-delivered tomorrow, through legal channels, not family ones. That evening, just as the sun dipped low and the house filled with orange light, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't my sister's name on the screen. It was my father. I let it ring twice before answering. "You've made your point," he said immediately. No greeting, no small talk. His voice was low, controlled. "But this doesn't end here." "I know," I replied calmly. Silence stretched across the line. Then he exhaled slowly. "You think you can shut us out, but you've benefited from this family too. Don't forget that." "I haven't forgotten anything," I said. "That's why I'm finally acting." His tone hardened. "You'll regret this." I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "We'll see." I ended the call first. After hanging up, I sat by the living room window in the fading light. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually made me uneasy after a confrontation. But this time it felt different. This was the silence of decisions settling into place. I thought about the years I'd spent biting my tongue, signing where they pointed, keeping the family peace at the cost of my own boundaries. Tonight, for the first time, the balance had shifted. They thought they'd backed me into a corner. What they didn't realize was that I'd built doors into that corner, and now I was walking through one they didn't even know existed. The house was still bathed in that warm orange light from the setting sun. The last rays stretched across the living room floor like long, soft fingers. I sat in my chair near the window, my hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, feeling the weight of quiet resolve settle deep in my chest. Then right on cue, I heard tires crunching over the gravel driveway. They were back. Their car doors shut almost in unison. Through the thin curtains, I saw them standing side by side on the porch. My father with his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his stance rigid. My sister clutching her purse like a lifeline. Their faces were a mix of forced calm and tightly contained panic. I didn't move right away. I let them knock. Once. Twice. A third time. When I finally opened the door, I didn't say anything. I stepped aside. "Come in." They entered hesitantly this time, not with the entitled ease they usually carried, but like people walking into a courtroom they hadn't expected to face so soon. My father broke the silence first. "We need to talk," he said firmly, as if he was still in charge. "I'm listening," I replied, taking my seat by the window again. I didn't offer them seats. They stood. My sister glanced at him nervously, then spoke. "Look, things got out of hand. We just want to figure this out as a family." "Do you?" I asked. "Yes," she said quickly, too quickly. "We're all under a lot of stress and maybe we made some mistakes." "Mistakes," I repeated softly. "Is that what we're calling fraud now?" Her mouth snapped shut. My father cleared his throat. "We've been talking. Maybe it's best if we just forget about what happened this week. Start fresh. We'll handle our own problems, you handle yours." His tone was smooth, practiced. He'd spent years smoothing things over this way. It was his signature move: minimize, redirect, make it sound like a shared misunderstanding. But this time he wasn't talking to the woman who used to nod along and write a check. "I can't do that," I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why not?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on my knees. "Because I'm not interested in forgetting. I'm interested in accountability." My sister's voice broke in, high and strained. "This isn't you. You've always believed in family. You've always helped us." I looked at her steadily. "And how has that worked out for me?" She faltered. "We're your family," she repeated weakly. "I know," I said. "And that's exactly why this hurts so much." The room went quiet. Outside, crickets had started their soft evening chorus. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. The house, my house, felt like a stage now. Every sound amplified, every silence sharpened. I stood slowly and walked over to the sideboard. From the top drawer, I took out the envelope I'd prepared earlier, the formal legal letter. The paper inside was crisp, the words precise, every line a boundary I'd finally drawn. I held it up between my fingers. "This," I said, "is going out tomorrow morning. It documents every forged signature, every unauthorized attempt, Every illegal action you took this week. My father's jaw clenched. My sister's eyes widened. This isn't a threat, I continued. It's a notice. A line between what you used to get away with and what happens now. My sister stepped forward, tears welling up. Please. You can't do this to us. We're family. If this gets out, if this becomes legal, it'll ruin everything. I raised an eyebrow. It might ruin your plans. But it won't ruin me. You don't understand, she whispered. No, I said quietly, I understand perfectly. For years I told myself that keeping the peace was more important than drawing boundaries. I believed that helping you would make you love me. But all it did was teach you how to take without asking. My father finally spoke, his voice harder now. You're making this into something bigger than it needs to be. You want to embarrass us? Is that it? I met his gaze head on. No. I want to protect what's mine. And I want you to face what you've done. He took a step toward me, not threatening, but with that familiar weight he used to carry when he expected me to yield. You think a few papers and a lawyer can scare me? He asked. I didn't flinch. No, I said softly. But losing access to my accounts, my properties and my name? That's already happening. This, I lifted the envelope slightly, is just the part where you find out the consequences aren't in your hands anymore. For a moment something flickered across his face. Not rage, not arrogance, but something he'd never shown me before. Uncertainty. My sister began crying in earnest now, but even through the tears, I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was crying at me not for what she'd done. You don't have to do this, she sobbed. We can fix it. We'll stop. Please. I shook my head slowly. If you wanted to fix it, you wouldn't have started it. The tears faltered. Her mouth opened then closed. I walked to the door and opened it. The cool night air drifted in, carrying the faint scent of cut grass. It's time to go, I said. My father stared at me, stunned by the finality in my voice. My sister hesitated, wiping at her cheeks as if waiting for me to break like I always had. I didn't. They walked out slowly like people leaving a place they no longer recognized. At the threshold my father turned back. His voice was lower now, stripped of its earlier confidence. This isn't over, he said. I looked at him evenly. It is for me. I closed the door before he could answer. The latch clicked softly, a small sound, but it felt like the closing of a chapter I'd kept open far too long. The house was silent again. But unlike the silences of the past, tense, uncertain, filled with guilt, this one felt solid. Cling. I set the envelope down on the table, ready for the morning courier. But something unexpected happened then. I sat down and cried. Not out of regret but out of release. Years of swallowing hurt, years of carrying the burden of being the good one, years of letting their voices drown out mine. It all finally broke loose. The tears came quietly without drama. Just me, in my living room, in the house I'd worked for, finally reclaiming it not just legally but emotionally. Later that night I stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear, the stars scattered like quiet witnesses overhead. The air was cool, crisp, the way it gets in early fall. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and took a long, steady breath. I thought of my mother, of her quiet warnings, the way she used to say, strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just standing your ground when no one expects you to. I smiled faintly. She'd been right. The next morning was simple. I dropped the envelope off with my lawyer, watched it get logged and stamped, and walked out of his office feeling lighter than I had in decades. There were still steps ahead. Legal proceedings, financial untangling, but the reckoning wasn't about paperwork. It was about standing up finally as the woman I'd always been beneath the layers of guilt and obligation. As I drove home, sunlight spilled through the windshield, warm on my hands gripping the wheel. My phone buzzed with a message from my sister. I didn't open it. Not out of spite, but because I didn't owe her my immediate attention anymore. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood quiet and steady. Truly mine. I stood in the entryway listening to the stillness. There was no dread this time. No weight pressing down. Just peace. For the first time I wasn't reacting to their story. I was writing my own. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window as morning light flooded in. The same space where they'd once cornered me had become the place where I'd quietly dismantled their control. This wasn't just revenge. It was liberation. And as the first sip of coffee warmed my throat, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would never call me their safety net again. If this story made your heart race or left you with chills, hit subscribe. More dark, emotional revenge stories are waiting, because sometimes justice whispers before it strikes.